tour. Today we have with us Nanna Heidenreich, and she's a professor of digital narratives and theory at the IFS, which is the International Film School in Cologne, in Germany. And she's also a curator for film and video theory. And as such, she has worked with International Film Festival in Berlin, Forum Expanded, the Goethe Institutes in Marseille and Seoul, the HKW Berlin, and the Academy of Arts of the World in Cologne. And some of her writings and publications and projects can be found on her website, and I would really urge you all to actually explore a range of things that she's kind of found out of her own curiosity, I should say. And today she is actually going to open up a world which actually is very, very centrally concerned to us. It's concerning climate change, and we have kind of already witnessed the Australian fires which are in the news right now, which kind of immediately ring concern for us. And just complementing to that, today's discussion will be around the notion of ice, and I'll kind of keep the excitement of the stories and narratives that weave different parts of the world through ice to Nanna to kind of explore in her talk. But it's really interesting how she is looking through a range of different kinds of institutions, geographies, and cultural issues that are emerging out of this material of which is kind of engulfing almost humanity. So let me call Nanna on stage to kind of elaborate upon her work. Welcome, Nanna.
Thank you, Anuj. And let me first say I'm very happy to be here. I'm quite excited and also a little intimidated. This looks like a really great school. And I look forward to the discussion. I brought a lot of clips also with me, moving image examples, so that always takes time. It's a time-based medium. And I hope I'm not going too overboard. But I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I believe last fall we had a student presentation around rising sea levels here. So anyway, I believe I learned probably as much from you as you might learn from or interested in what I'm talking about today. Not least because, as Anuj rightfully said, it's kind of like, I'm not, when I talk about the Arctic or the ice, I'm not, I mean, you may think I come from Germany, which is a cold country, but snow is, there's sometimes snow, but it's not my natural environment. It's as far away from me as it is for you, but actually the interesting thing is that I found that it's as close to you as it is close to me, or it's as relevant to all of us. And I ended up there, and maybe by means of introduction, to place my work. So I'm said I teach in a digital narratives program. Actually, that light's fun, I think. As a media studies scholar, I have a first degree in social sciences. I once studied chemistry, did a physics degree, and then did a PhD in cultural studies. I ended up working in the cinema for a film festival because I was interested in that space as a political space, and I became a curator. Not because I wanted to work in the contemporary art world, but because I was interested in it as a public space. My major area of research, the one that sticks out the most, is has to do with migration, with what in Europe has become called critical migration and border regime studies. So migration is my big subject. So how, why now the Arctic ice has, among other things, to do with, I think you can leave that on, right? Yeah. Has to do with, indeed, with climate change. And it all started when I was invited to a conference on digital cultures by a friend of mine, and she asked me to do something on prognosis and projection. And she's actually a founding figure in this critical migration studies network. And I realized that one of the ways of communicating climate change is through migration, through the prediction of migration. If you look at the reports by the United Nations, for instance, they all say climate change will produce mass migration, internal migration, but also globally. And since you live in the country of contested border zones, you are probably also familiar with this, that this panic around migration and the negative image is highly problematic. So migration has become entangled in the affirmation of climate change in a difficult way. Now, following the trajectory of climate change somehow took me, there were also other reasons, took me to the ocean, and somehow the ocean became more and more solidified into ice, but of course also because we live in an age of rising sea levels. So what I want to talk about today is, in a sense, very timely, very urgent, or you could say somehow. And what I want to focus on is the whole new frontier spirit that is both surrounding the Arctic, but also with phenomena to do with climate change, and certain areas such as the deep sea, but also outer space. And I'm interested in particular in the form of the expedition. Now that's like, expeditions and adventures, that's part and parcel of the whole old history of colonialism, of people venturing out from Europe, trying to discover parts of the world that need no discovering because people live there. But today, many of the things we face in research, in tourism, in the arts, but also in business development, is framed with the terminology of new frontier and of expedition. And I'm very interested in how that is presented, and also interested in how this is entangled with media forms and formats. As I said, I work mostly in critical migration studies. And recently, on the invitation of my friend Madhu, who's sitting in the back, one of your academic advisors, I think, for the school, I did a symposium called Hotspots, Migration and the Sea. Here, that's what it looked like. So that's just my part of my desktop at a certain time, what it looks like, and that's a pile of books on the floor of my study. And it brought together certain aspects of marine research and migration. Now, I named it Hotspots because Hotspots is the name the European Union has given to refugee camps as an attempt to bring in the logics of logistics into migration regulation. Which is not a new idea, this idea that migration should be regulated, but it was another attempt of pretending that it can be, when in fact, of course, migration always exceeds any attempt to control it, which is a good thing. I should mention that also the issue of migration in Germany happens mostly, or one of the central sites is the Mediterranean Sea. And this is because airlines, people cross the Mediterranean Sea in precarious little vessels to come to Europe to flee war in Syria, for instance, when in fact they could just board a flight, right? There are airplanes going back and forth. But the European Union has issued not even a law, but basically holds airlines accountable for transporting people without proper papers. And only because of the financial implications, airlines refuse to take on people who don't have a proper visa. That means, because of that, people have to board precarious vessels and die by the thousands. So the Mediterranean Sea has in itself become a hotspot. Here are just a few numbers. Since 1996, more than 75,000 migrant deaths have been recorded globally. The vast majority of migrants who have died trying to reach Europe have drowned. Volunteers have logged more than 27,000 drowned deaths, deaths by drowning, since 1993 in the Mediterranean alone. But this data is not comprehensive. We don't really have proper records of every incident because it happens clandestine. It happens without actual sort of surveillance is a bad thing, without being acknowledged. So the true death toll is probably much, much higher, which means that small sea, the Mediterranean Sea, is full of death. So the sea itself is also a hotspot, as I said, but not only because of that, and so are other seas, other oceans. There are sites of endangered biodiversity. There are sites of infrastructural development, of new technologies, of research, of the endlessly growing economy of tourism, of adventures and discovery, and of geopolitical fault lines. The latter includes the negotiation or renegotiation or actual undermining of the concept of the oceans as the common heritage of mankind, which is how they're defined since 1982, since the United Nations law, the Sea Treaty, has been passed. That is, all those parts of the oceans that aren't within national territory are considered internal waters or are part of the exclusive economic zones of 200 nautical miles from the coast, are considered the common heritage of mankind and are under the jurisdiction of international law. This international law, for instance, requires all vessels, everybody at sea, to provide assistance if they encounter a vessel in distress or a person in distress. Now, what is happening in the Mediterranean Sea is basically the refusal to provide assistance, the refusal to rescue people in distress, which is a breaking of international law. But, and this is the logic of migration, as long as you can't access that law, because you can claim that law through the logic of the nation state, through the logic of belonging, you have very little chance of bringing it to court. So this is just to explain to you why hotspots. So the seas are literally on the rise, and they're also on the rise because this ice is melting, right? Sea levels are rising, and the sea is on the rise, as I said, economically, politically, militarily, technologically, philosophically, and in the arts. In the area of humanities, for instance, people have declared the blue humanities or the oceanic turn. There's an art project of several iterations called Tidalectics. And you will find, at least in the international biennial art circus, many such thematic focus on the ocean, on the tide, on there are new film festivals around underwater perspectives, etc. The other side of this is, and I want to repeat this, is profit margins, is widening profit margins. There are investment neologisms like blue bioeconomy, trying to turn the oceans into a biological resource that can be harvested. Then also, of course, the way research is entangled in this. Deep sea biology, for instance, is closely tied to astrobiology, or it's a different term, to biology of outer space. So the knowledge that people produce in the deep sea is lent to figure out how to colonize space. And I'm using this term because if whatever you look into Netflix, any science fiction story is all about colonization of space, which I find also not only peculiar, but it should concern us that that is so normal to talk about colonization and that you can make a lot of money from astro mining, etc. Today, more than 90 or about 90% of global trade is happening on the oceans. So it's not just what you can harvest from the deep seabed in terms of minerals or from the blue bioeconomy of the fish and the jellyfish and whatever in the oceans. It's also that the oceans are relevant in terms of transport, highly relevant. So, and that will become, that's also one of the reasons why I'm interested in the Arctic. Is that working? I mean, I know it's working, but should I readjust it a little? Is that better? Yeah? So in addition to the economic, political, military, and research boom in the oceans, they also serve as the site for countless film and video productions, for which new cameras and new sound technologies have been developed and are still being developed, completing the shift of media from the air to the water. And one of the sort of promises of new media is immersion, right? Virtual reality, for instance, is always sold as the maximum immersive experience. So underwater film and video works are high in demand. And this is where I want to turn to, and then take that towards the ice. In 1951, American marine biologist and writer Rachel Carson published her second book, The Sea Around Us. Carson's last publication, shortly before her untimely death, The Silent Spring from 1962, is often referred to as the founding text for the environmental movement. It was the first text that addressed how pesticides keep enriching in nature, and she faced a lot of trouble from the industry, of course. But before she wrote that book, she was known as the poetic scientist of the oceans. When The Sea Around Us came out in the summer of 1951, it was before an American reading public that already had been caught up in a kind of a literary rapture of the deep, as Charlotte Hagwood argues in her PhD thesis. In 1950, National Geographic had featured undersea photography, some of the first of their kind, taken by Jacques Cousteau and Frédéric Dumas, who had pioneered the new technology of the aqualung, which we now today know as scuba diving. Here, these are the first aqualungs, and that's, I think, to the left is Cousteau. That's definitely Cousteau. Cousteau captured, perhaps more than any other figure of his time, the liberatory spirit of marine explorations and the thrilling potential of the technologies which supported this course of discovery. And I start with this because this is already where this idea of technological advancement and exploration and expedition and adventure spirit comes together with media and with scientific research. So here, Jacques Cousteau in 1963. The gist of my life's work had been to free man from the bondage to the surface, permit him to escape beyond natural boundaries, breathe in an irrespirable medium and resist pressure of ever-increasing immensities. And not only to put man there, but to help him adapt, explore, subsist, survive, and learn. In the same time, just to give you a framework, there was also the publication of Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, from 1952, but also Herman Wouk's The Cane Mutiny, from 1951, which turned into the Dimitrik film with the same title with Humphrey Bogart that became extremely successful. I think it won an Academy Award. There's a lot of Academy Award winning in my talk tonight, not because I really care, but because I think it's significant. Then there was Thor Heyerdahl's 1947 voyage, the Contiki. I don't know if any of you know about this, which is basically a floating a raft with which he tried to prove a different logic of settlement in the world. And it was that too was a highly mediated event. They had a 60mm camera with them on board of that raft, and it turned into two films, the Contiki expedition from 1950 and again Academy Award winning documentary by Heyerdahl and Laudema together. So The Sea Around Us by Rachel Carson was probably, though, the most successful of all these publications here in this book. It had an enormous media response. It even created a new format in the New York Times in covering it. And this was all the more surprising because she was hitherto a more or less unknown writer. She had already published Under the Sea Wind in 1941, but that went more or less unnoticed. And she was very poor. She just struggled to get an education, and she had to work in the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, later known as the Fish and Wildlife Service, to earn a living for not just for herself, but a large number of relatives, and had to therefore also find the time to write. These books, by the way, are available. Her books are available online. There, I think you don't have to buy them. They're in public realm now, and they're beautiful to read. The book's success in the context of this general fascination for the oceans had to do with the intersections of technological progress and scientific inquiry, as well as with the formation of a new relationship of humankind and the natural world in light of exactly those technological advances. One which also showed in what came to be known as globalization. As one reviewer, this is the Contiki by the way, that raft that I talked about. As one reviewer, Paul Flowers, wrote in the Memphis Appeal, I quote, "The planet has shrunk thanks to technological advances in transportation, communication, and electronics. Whether we like it or not, we are beginning to regard this as one world, and even far in the interior, people are aware of and interested in the great forces of nature, which affect the daily lives of individuals." The sea around us won immediate acclaim because it narrated scientific truths in language the layman could comprehend. It explained the birth of continents from the sea's womb. It told graphically how climate, even far from salt breezes, comes from the vast production line of the marine two-thirds of our planet. It related in dramatic language of how life began in the sea and came ashore only when life had developed complexities adequate to enable living creatures to survive out of the water. The phrase like the beginning, the origin of the world, the fact that two-thirds of the planet are water, all of these are sort of also contemporary images often evoked when we talk about this deep sea. What is not said here is what is also a common phrase is saying the deep sea we know less about than we know about outer space and the moon. In 1952, Irwin Allen acquired the film rights to this book, The Sea Around Us. His 1953 film, which he produced and edited, however, speaks more to his own proclivity to science fiction and spectacular genres than to the book itself and its author's poetic engagement with nature and with science. Though this film too eventually claimed an Oscar, an Academy Award for photography, a testament to the allure of underwater photography in an era when it was fairly rare art, this recognition was perhaps the only aspect of the film that turned out well. Originally, he conceived the film as a rousing epic of biblical proportions. Irwin Allen had planned to use original camera work and animations in a series of narratives based around different episodes in the book, but quickly found out the budget wouldn't do. So what resulted instead is, on the one hand, interesting because it's an archival work, a found footage work, but it really doesn't look anything like the book itself. He was able to string together from donations of no less than 2,341 universities, libraries, expeditions, and marine research institutions all over the world, the material that he then edited together in his The Sea Around Us. So, mainly a job of assembly designated to fascinate the eye and excite the imagination, the film evidences the life of the seas but does not explain. So Mosley Crowther in his review in the New York Times. I'm showing you now the end of that film, which lent the title to my talk today.
The oceans of the world are responsible for many things, some good, some bad. Very possibly the most interesting of all is the proof that the sea dominates the world's climate. Tracking the sea's elusive answers through the great white waste is among the most difficult of all scientific adventures. The men who seek the secrets of the seas and the Arctic are a special breed of hero. By ship, on foot, by dog team, they hunt the key to the world's climate. There is a theory so startling and so scientifically documented that all the world might well take notice. The theory is that here in the Arctic waste, buried beneath 1 billion tons of frozen sea, hides an astonishing secret. If all the ice in all the world continues to melt, the levels of all the seas will rise 100 feet or more, and the great coastal cities of all the world might well be drowned. It has been a established beyond all reasonable doubt that the great Arctic change of climate started somewhere about 1900 and has spread so rapidly that small glaciers have already disappeared and the big ones are melting at a startling rate. Man, with all the science of the past at his command, now knows that the melting of all these glaciers, coupled with the drastic upheaval of the land masses of the globe, might one day drown more than half the Earth.
What is the fate of the world? Is this the end?
Rachel Carson was appalled at the film. She never sold film rights to any of her books again. But Irwin Allen went on to become an incredibly successful inventor of television genres, mostly about celebrities, and of spectacular science fiction films. Now, if you read the book, indeed, Carson speaks about rising sea levels, and in here they talk about climate change, but you need to know, and this is how old this fascination with the ice is, this is not assuming that climate change has anything to do with humankind's destroying of the world. This is saying that in the faraway future, somehow the sun will come closer to the earth, temperatures will rise, ice will melt, and it just lent itself for Irwin Allen to make a spectacular film. But this very wording, hunting the key to the world's climate, the men who are doing this are a special kind of breed. The adventure is something that continues until today. And just as a little other side remark, in that film, it's difficult to hear, but he's referring to this understanding of climate change as something from the 19th century. Now, the 19th century, there was one year, in 1848, that was, at least in Europe, the year without summer because of a volcano outbreak, and because temperatures dropped so much that people were afraid another ice age would come. Mary Shelley wrote her book Frankenstein in that summer of no sun because they were all sitting inside trying not to be cold. Very productive, but nonetheless. One of the reasons, as I said already, I'm interested in the ice and the Arctic is the question of the communication of global warming or climate change. What we understand climate change to be today is we understand it to be a set of data, right? And we understand it as something that is extrapolated into the future via projections. In their own way, experimental forms of storytelling, because who knows what the future looks like. So data are being collected and then climate change is projected. The general agreement is that because climate equals data, it is abstract and thus needs concretization or needs visualization. Now, the visualization of data is not a new problem, right? Every whatever natural scientist is producing data that then becomes visualized in diagrams and graphs, and then there's all politics around that. But in terms of the extrapolation into the future, there's also a lot of reflection on how this visualization happens. And as I said before, one way of communicating climate change is through the prediction of mass migration. Migration, again, is viewed as a wave, as a future wave, not just the result of rising sea levels, but in itself some sort of rising sea level. I've worked quite a lot in the past 2 years on exactly that connection, but I want to point out two things. One is that as much as it's of course true that when sea levels rise, people are being displaced and therefore they migrate. But migration has to be understood not as a flood, as a threat, or as a wave, but as an adaptation strategy, and ultimately as a social and political movement, because people migrate. They imagine a future elsewhere, and therefore also a future otherwise. And I should say that, and I never stop saying that. Ultimately, what I'm interested in is this very question, how to imagine otherwise. And migration for me is one of the ways you can actually learn to think otherwise. One of the it might be surprising, but one of the forms or genres in which this kind of connection between climate change and migration resonates is in the form, in the genre of the nature film or the animal film. And these animal moving images especially frame what literary scholar Ursula Heise from Stanford University has called charismatic megafauna, meaning specific animals that everyone gets sort of like teary-eyed or interested in, but only specific creatures. At the moment, with the fires in Australia, I don't know how many of you see things popping up on social media around koala bears, right? So the koala bear is one of such charismatic megafauna. Everybody feels extremely upset, and they're so cute. I mean, I've seen many films of like someone giving a little water bottle to a koala, and you just want to also hug them and, you know, and rescue a koala bear. When in fact, as we can all imagine, there's hundreds of insects and plants and little creatures, maybe those most annoying creatures that bite and sting and whatnot, that also die, but they don't feature. They don't feature because they don't feature in that emotive, in this emotional frame. And this is also important, this sort of what Heise also calls the species elegies, like you only mourn certain species, but not all of them. And it is framed in a very specific aesthetic, one that I would say has a lot to do with GoPro cameras and with National Geographic. So let me go again back to the 1950s. Beginning in the late 40s, Walt Disney had produced a new nature film format, The True Life Adventures, a series which created a whole new genre, or at least a whole new mass audience for wildlife films. One of the feature-length films in the series was the tellingly named White Wilderness from 1958. The film was directed by James Algar and narrated by Winston Hibler. It was filmed on location, or it said it did so, in the North American Arctic, mainly in Canada, over the course of 3 years. It too won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, just like The Sea Around Us. And just like The Sea Around Us, it is a spectacle dramatizing struggles with nature, against nature, and in nature. Variety, for example, called the film a fascinating screen experience, filmed in awesome detail in the icy wastes of the Arctic, where struggle for existence is savage and cruel. The film is notorious for its depiction and propagation of a lemming mass suicide in the Arctic Ocean. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this creature that is supposedly committing suicide. Has anyone heard of the lemming? It's a little rodent that looks a bit like a weasel. Do you have any hairy little rodents comparable? Maybe like what are the ones who run up and down trees? Yeah, like a squirrel maybe, like a type of squirrel, but it lives mainly in the ground. It's also hairy. And there's a whole myth around it that they commit mass suicide. Yeah. In reality, the scene with the lemmings mass suicide was shot at Bow River in downtown Calgary. It wasn't shot in the Canadian Arctic, and it was actually not the Arctic lemming. It was some other lemming that was locally living there locally, and they bought it off for a few bucks from local Indigenous kids. It showed the native Western Canadian lemming, which is not known to migrate, much less to commit mass suicide, as was revealed in a TV show called Cruel Camera in 1982 on Canadian television. This TV show also showed that setup of camera bulldozer with which they shoved the lemmings over the cliff, as you will see in a second, but also the snow-covered turntable they used to film with a camera from different angles to create that story. So that's the poster, White Wilderness, documentary, yeah, won an award for documentary. Okay, I'll stop here. You'll see certain features, the music, but also that very story. The voiceover, how it makes sense of what we see, the type of editing and camera that becomes narrativized into a Darwinian biology of cause and effect, and also of survival. Overpopulation leads to mass migration, leads to uncontrollable move of masses, to suicide, to survival of the fittest kind of. Just keep that in mind. Let me go now to someone you probably are familiar with. To David Attenborough. He's probably the most or the best known animal storyteller globally today. And not only today, since the 1970s, he has produced numerous radio and TV shows on wildlife and nature. He's especially known for writing and presenting in conjunction with the BBC's Natural History Unit, the 9 natural history documentary series forming the so-called Life Collection, that together claims to constitute a comprehensive study of animal and plant life on Earth. His 2017 series, Blue Planet 2, who has watched Blue Planet? No one? No? That's it, yeah. Me too. Was so successful, supposedly, that when people, like globally again, or in many countries, that in China, there was this urban myth of like streaming of Blue Planet led to the slowing down of the internet. That successful. Most recently, he narrated a documentary on climate change as well as the film Wild Karnataka, which has been advertised as, here, I don't know if anyone's seen it, has been advertised as India's first blue chip natural history film, but has also gained some criticism for receiving part of the funding from a mining company. I would like now to focus on one specific episode from the Blue Planet series, again, that one that was so successful in China, the internet slowed down, the controversial walrus sequence, which was shot in Svalbard. Svalbard is a Arctic archipelago under Norwegian rule, and I will come back to that. The scene shows how walruses are being forced to gather on land due to less ice being available. Usually they gather on ice. According to Attenborough's narration, the more than 100,000 walruses are left gathering on a single beach out of desperation because their natural habitat, the sea ice, has moved to the north. Under these conditions, walruses are a danger to themselves, Attenborough says, before the documentary shifted attention to a group of walruses who have scaled up on an 80-meter cliff in search of space for rest, as he says. The segment highlights that walruses have poor eyesight. So when walruses, like when we go into water, we see badly, right? Because our eyes are shaped in a specific form. When walruses are in water, they see well, but their sort of globe eyeballs don't see very well in air. So the segment highlights that walruses have poor eyesight out of water, but can feel the presence of the ocean and the presence of other animals at the bottom of the cliff, and are left looking for a way to return to the sea in order to search for food. A walrus is then shown half jumping, half falling down a cliff, painfully bouncing against the rocky surface. Several other animals follow suit, suffering the same tragic fall. I quote again Attenborough, "In their desperation to return to the sea, hundreds fall from the heights they should never have scaled." The sequence ends with close-ups of the walrus' still bodies lying at the bottom of the cliff. The Atlantic, the journal Atlantic, drew a link to the Disney's lemming scene, commenting that, contrary to popular belief, not even lemmings dive off cliffs, and thus marking the event as an unusual occurrence. Many people commented on the scene, describing it as heartbreaking, as disturbing or shocking, and as difficult to watch. And after social media had been teeming with expressions of distress, Netflix, the provider which streams the series, produced a behind-the-scenes video for the scene and wrote, "This video contains scenes that some viewers might find difficult to watch." Yes, sir. I always think I should go further. Okay, sorry. What the scene shows, the big haul out, is not per se unusual, and walruses have always died at these haul outs, not least because of aggression amongst the densely stacked bodies, especially male territorialism and male competition. However, the ice is indeed melting, and walruses are forced to haul out on solid land in the thousands, and thus in much larger numbers than usual. However, I believe this again is a scene of
I don't understand. Why are they going up there? Like, literally to the top of the rockiest part of the cliff.
Once at the top of the 80-metre cliffs, they rest until it's time to return to the sea in search of food.
So that's the last little section, isn't it? The really steep bit, and they all just... It's really steep, that bit.
One's going to go. There's one right on the edge. There's probably 200 or 300 dead walrus on like a half-mile stretch of beach here. They're exhausted because they're having to swim 100 miles now to get to food, and then coming back here because it's the only place to sleep. They used to sleep on the ice, dive down, eat the food, sleep on the ice, easy. And now they're swimming 100 miles, coming to this place, climbing cliffs, and they're just exhausted and falling down and either being killed, falling, or just crushing each other because there's 7,000 crammed onto little tiny bits of
sheer
beaches.
physicality of what we see is hard to bear. The huge heavy bodies, walruses weigh up to 1 ton, tumbling and falling. It's also this, like, you're afraid that they might just explode, basically. And one could say that this scene falls into the frame of what has been called ecological grief or climate grief, something that mostly North American writers have come up. I, however, as much as I too am affected by this, am highly suspicious of this modulation of emotions, of modulation of effect, the editing, the highly emotive music, as with most Attenborough works done by composer Hans Zimmer, the emotionality of it. I believe that as it is a well-established genre, a mainstream aesthetics, it does not enable anything. It shocks, but it doesn't enable. Framing like this scene, or in Disney's Lemming episode, focus again solely on one singular species, and ultimately on the logic of this Darwinian biology of cause and effect, and of one cause and one effect. While what we need, I believe, is an aesthetics and a perspective of interrelatedness, of connection, where the small matters as much as the spectacular. Let's say the change in microbial composition, for example, and not just the large species. We need to listen to non-Darwinian biology, such as, for example, as once was proposed by Austrian Paul Kammerer, the Austrian biologist who ran the infamous vivarium here, former aquarium then turned lab in Vienna in the 1910s and 20s. He suggested Genossenschaften von Lebewesen statt Kampf der Arten, cooperatives of living beings instead of the struggles of species. I'll now shift to 3 clips, even though we're kind of ahead in time. Maybe I have to cut it short, of 3 to another, probably before the koala bear entered all of our social media streams, the polar bear, the icon of global warming, and with it, the glacier also as a species of extinction. So first I'll show you a music video, post-punk, remastered film music video from like a hit from the 1980s, from the so-called New German Wave by Swiss band Grauzone, and this is the English version of it that was remastered in 2010. I just thought I'd bring you something from where I'm from. I have to stop it because of time, but anyway, I also showed that video because even though this is actually a love song, it's a song about a broken heart and how easy it would be to be a polar bear in Antarctica. This is from 1980. Everything would be so easy, no problems. But somehow that music video has everything in it that the Arctic is about now. I mean, he sings about the Antarctic, but it's basically, you see all the industrial and buildings in the background. This is basically what the Arctic is today, and I'll get back to that. So the second one, I just show this one. This is iconic. This is Al Gore. Al Gore, the film An Inconvenient Truth from 2006. Al Gore was touring mainly North America with this multimedia show about environmental issues, and that was turned into a documentary called Inconvenient Truth. And this is a clip and animation of a polar bear that became sort of infamous. And you'll see that whole story. You have a species on the verge of extinction, encountering another species on the verge of extinction, both true. The ice breaking, disappearing, polar bear can't get safely out of the waters. Now, this establishment of the polar bear as the icon of climate change has a long history, and one key player in this is National Geographic. National Geographic first sort of introduced the polar bear as an anthropomorphized, so made human identified, like you identify with it as almost a human creature, as subjects of identification. Then polar bears were visually connected to the endangered Arctic. And finally, they emerged as ambassadors of a threatened ecosystem and icons of climate change. National Geographic was founded in 1988. That's also significant because with the headline, inspiring people to care about the planet. The same year, the IPCC was founded, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the very same year. National Geographic still has over 7 million readers worldwide despite this declining print circulation. Most successful, of course, is their online presence as well, at least in the USA, or in the US, is the TV station Nat Geo TV, which was founded in 2001. National Geographic had and still has a significant influence in the field of nature photography and is considered generally as a generator of icons. In the summer of 2015, German photographer Kerstin Langenberger was in Svalbard. You recall the Norwegian archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. This is just to give you an idea of the Arctic Ocean. Can I show you where is this here? This is Svalbard, and I should mention this. This concerns all of us because this is where the global seed vault is placed. This is where all the seeds of plants of the world supposedly are frozen for eternity. The permafrost that is supposed to be there is thawing. They now have to cool it artificially. In 2016, the door was flooded. Now they cool it to minus 18 degrees with energy harvested from local coal, which is kind of ironic, come to think of it. Svalbard is also interesting for me because it's a visa-free zone. It's under Norwegian rule. If you go there, you can settle. Everybody has a right to go there. You just have to find a roof over your head because it's very, very, very cold. up to minus 40 degrees Celsius. And you have to have some sort of income, right? But if you stay there for 7 years, you become naturalized as a Norwegian citizen. So that's, I think, is a nice. There's more to say about Svalbard, but I leave that for now. Anyway, so German photographer Kerstin Langenberger was on a was a tour guide for photo tourists in search of polar bears in Svalbard. She discovered an extremely emaciated polar bear, which she photographed and posted with a long comment on her Facebook on her Facebook site and her blog. She writes, "For tourists and nature photographers, the main reason to travel to Svalbard is to experience polar bears in the wild. And yes, most of the time we find them, beautiful and photogenic bears. This is followed by a long debate on whether the polar bear population in the Arctic is declining and whether this is a consequence of climate change." She ends her entry as follows. "I cannot scientifically substantiate my observations, but I can draw conclusions, and I can say that climate change is changing the Arctic at a rate I never thought possible." A month later, National Geographic photographer Paul Nicklin put a photo of an apparently starved dead polar bear, which he had also photographed in Svalbard, on Instagram. He also described the reason for this trip, the search for polar bears to photograph them. And in all of my years growing up in the Arctic and later working as a biologist, I had never found a dead polar bear. It is now becoming more and more common. Paul Nicklin, together with Christina Mittermeier, is the founder of Sea Legacy, a Canadian non-profit organization of photographers and filmmakers whose aim is, I quote, to protect the oceans by means of high-impact visual storytelling. The main part of the work is expeditions. Here, our work, expeditions, campaigns, solutions. Or, in other words, the hunt for images. This video of a starving polar bear was published by National Geographic in 2017 by Nicklin and Mittermeier, who were declared Adventurers of the Year by National Geographic in 2018. It was filmed in the Canadian Arctic and opened with the sentence, "This is what climate change looks like." 1 year later, after heavy criticism of the claimed causality, what the bear died of, no one knows, this caption was changed. "This is what a starving polar bear looks like." With an editorial note on this change, National Geographic published an article by Mittermeier in 2018 in which she explains the history of the origin of the pictures. You will recall that as early as 2015, Nicklin and Langenberger had both established and defended the causal link between polar bear mortality and dwindling ice on social media. Mittermeier writes in 2018, "Photographer Paul Nicklin and I are on a mission to capture images that communicate the urgency of climate change. Documenting its effects on wildlife hasn't been easy. With this image, we thought we had found a way to help people imagine what the future of climate change might look like. We were perhaps naive. The picture went viral and people took it literally." Why she does not date the genesis of the image of the starving polar bear as an icon of climate change to 2014, but to 17, irritates and seems to serve only the coherency of the story, which is not necessary. Things are complex and they're bad enough as it is. The very story for which Mittermeier and Nicklin called in their Sea SWAT team after the discovery of the emaciated bear. Sea SWAT missions is a deployable unit of storytellers who cover urgent issues. As you probably know, the term SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics, and in the US refers to law enforcement units which use military equipment and tactics. I'll leave it at that. Not least because it's about images that stand in for an end of something. The death of the polar bear, the possible species extinction, and the end of the Arctic ice. I recall French philosopher and semiotician Roland Barthes his text Rhetoric of the Image from 1964, which he wrote when he was thinking about advertisements, about ads, commercial ads. In this text, he asks, how does meaning get into the image? Where does it end? And if it ends, what is there beyond? For me, the problematic here concerns two aspects. One is the lack of complexity, again, of interconnections. Attenborough and National Geographic draw straight lines between climate change, sea ice loss, bigger haulouts, overcrowding, climbing walruses, falling walruses, and starving polar bears. And straight lines, direct causality, especially in relation to environment, is always tricky. Recall here, again, the causality established between migration and climate change. Which is not to say that the argument is all wrong, but as much as I often feel speechless in the face of already apocalyptic environmental conditions and the seeming endless search for profit, especially in the face of climate change, that is something I cannot wrap my head around, but climate change is a for-profit business. Forms are connected. The crisis of climate, he argues, is also a crisis of culture and of the imagination. Not only in the sense of how climate change is depicted or communicated, but also how it is in the first place the result of a certain being in the world, of how we are seeing ourselves in the world. And we do that, of course, through art, through film, through popular formats, through books, through stories. And I'll just leave that quote here. I know. Thus, the Arctic itself is a hotspot, and I come to an end. After Columbus invaded the Americas in the 15th century, the European mind was obsessed with finding a shortcut to Asia, the so-called Northwest Passage. There's, of course, also a Northeast Passage, but that was more on the Russian side. It held great promises for global trade, colonialism, and of easy access to the Orient. You could basically, between 4,000 to 6,000 miles less than if you go around the bottom nowadays through the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal, but like the Panama Canal. If you go across the Arctic Ocean, that's like literally a shortcut. Many deadly expeditions set sail from Europe between the 16th and the 19th century. For 300 years, the Europeans wouldn't stop trying to find that Northwest Passage and send one explorer after the other who all died, or either just froze to death or first became cannibals because they ran out of food, but wouldn't stop. It's that kind of a drive. So now, I should mention one expedition in 1845 by John Franklin, who set sail with two boats, the Terror and the Erebus. Erebus is the Greek god of darkness. Never returned. The first to actually cross the Northwest Passage was Roald Amundsen in 1906, the same guy who won the race to the South Pole. Today, in the 21st century, the Arctic ice is melting. And this old dream of expansion, of profit, is fueled again. Remember, most of the trade happens on the world oceans. This began in 2007 when the European Space Agency announced that the sea ice in the Arctic had shrunk to its lowest level since satellite measurements began nearly 30 years ago. With the exception of the year 2013, which you see here, things have been like this and are only going downhill from there. There's the ice is disappearing, it's not coming back. This means larger transport vessels can now cross the passage both via the Northwest and the Northeast. The Arctic, here again, consists of land, internal waters, territorial seas, exclusive economic zones, and high seas above the Arctic Circle. All of these are under the jurisdiction of one of the 8 Arctic coastal states: Canada, Norway, Russia, Denmark, via Greenland. In case you don't know, Greenland is still a colony of Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, and the United States. International law regulates this area as with other portions of the Earth, but it is highly contested. So the waters beyond the territorial seas and the coastal states are considered the high seas, international waters. The waters in the sea bottom that is not confirmed to be extended continental shelf or exclusive economic zones are considered to be the heritage of mankind, as I said in the beginning. Fisheries in these waters can only be limited by international treaties, and exploration and exploitation of mineral resources on and below the seabed in these areas is administered by the UN International Seabed Authority, a tiny, tiny office located in Jamaica, but that's a story for another time. The status of certain portions of the Arctic Sea region is in dispute for various reasons. Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the United States all regard parts of the Arctic seas as national waters. Russia is even aiming at renaming the Arctic Ocean Russian Ocean. There are also disputes regarding what passages constitute international seaway and rights to passage along them. Thus, both the Northwest and the Northeast Passage are contemporary hotspots. The first is mostly a territorial claim of Canada versus the US, and the second is part of Russian plans for an Arctic empire, but also part of the Chinese Global Belt and Road Initiative. However, generally, and this is really important, the Arctic is one gigantic hotspot for future profits, for resources, for travel, for tourism, for moving image and other cultural productions, and for research. It holds enormous amounts of resources, of oil, gas, uranium, rare earths. And it has been an important, as I said, a hugely important site for the cultural imaginary of the European mind, of that period of colonialism and discovery. And they're using vocabulary that is pretty much the same now, just with slightly different players. You may recall Donald Trump's idiotic proposal to buy Greenland last year. I don't know if you remember. So that seemed really stupid, but of course it had a reason. Greenland now has a huge mining project. Greenland Minerals is an Australian-Chinese company who has been working on a project there for 10 years. It's supposed to start mining this year, uranium and rare earth. And their concept of how to get rid of radioactive dust is to spray water. On dust in the Arctic, water spraying, that's ice, right? It's not going to work. Never mind, that's not the biggest problem. It's the to cut it short, the fact that they can invest in something for 10 years means there's money beyond imagination. And the problem, that's why I mentioned Greenland is a colony of Denmark, and Greenland representatives are hoping through the money coming from the mining to gain independence. Very entangled. So I come to an end. One of the journalists who have been writing about this is the Italian writer Marzio Mian. He and his 3 colleagues have founded the Arctic Times Project in 2015. I quote from their website. It's an independent, non-profit group of journalists dedicated to shedding light on the profound economic, geopolitical, and cultural changes taking place in the Arctic region as a result of climate change. However, unfortunately, we need to look at their formatting again. They are, as they claim, reporting from the last frontier. Beautiful pictures they produce. Look at this or that. I quote from Jan, global warming has opened up a part of the world that's been closed off for all of our lives. A lot of people are looking up there to try to develop natural resources and infrastructure and sea routes. And all of that's happening in the shadow of global warming, of the global warming story. This is an opportunity to write about something new. And literally they say their dream is to produce journalistic expeditions. Now, another expedition, which is happening right now, Mosaic. Mosaic stands for a multidisciplinary drifting observatory for the study of Arctic climate. I'll just let you look at this. It's a 20-nation collaboration. It's actually quite stunning because it's literally collaboration with open access to the data that they produce. But they're going because the Arctic ice is disappearing. They're on a vessel, on a research vessel called Polarstern, from a German institute. There's one Indian on board, by the way, Vishnu Nandan. He's an Earth observation scientist from Kerala, currently postdoc in Canada. So one of the 20 nations is India. But they're drifting with a piece of Arctic ice for 1 year and measuring ice that they will not be able to measure ever again because it's disappearing. But it's also a gigantic media project. And with this, I just want to show you 3 sort of clips that I think we can discuss together in that aesthetic frame. One is
we need to understand the Arctic climate system better, and that requires measurements year-round, including the winter season, from the Central Arctic. So the only way to get there is to let us freeze in on the Siberian side of the Arctic, then use the ice drift to drift across the Arctic and take these measurements for a full year. In summer, we'll be able to break through that ice, and at that position, we'll turn our engines into idle and just let us freeze in. We'll set up a network of research stations on the ice, and all that has to happen during the first 3 weeks of the expedition when we still have some daylight left. Rather than fighting that ice, we work with the ice, and we work with the drift of the ice, and that will be our engine that carries us across the North Pole area. We'll be isolated there for long phases during the expedition. We are on our own and no one can get to us on a short time scale to bring us help. So we need to be able to deal with all medical problems or accidents on board. And we are going to work on that very dynamic sea ice surface, that thin layer of sea ice with a deadly ocean below that. So we need to make sure that no one ends up in that ocean. To bring back everybody safely, that is our main and overarching task. That is the most important thing in that expedition. And bring back all the data from the Central Arctic that we need to improve our climate model.
Erebus. Much mediated event at the time. They've been looking for those ships and the disappearance of that expedition since then, and they found the boats 2014 and 2016. They were found by the Arctic Research Foundation. That's an enterprise founded by Jim Balesley, the former CEO of BlackBerry. There's media in all of this. You know, James Cameron, for instance, the Titanic director, he held for the longest time the manned diving record in the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, and turned it also into not 3D, one of those IMAX spectacles. There's more to this, but I will, so the finding of those 2 ships, now you can go on very expensive tourism trips, or you can watch the series, The Terror, produced by AMC, the American Basic Cable Television Channel. And I'm just showing you the opening sequence. No, that's not it. The men and their expeditions. And finally, one of the documentaries that is now nominated for an Academy Award by Russian filmmaker Viktor Kozakovsky, Aquarela. I don't know if someone saw it in cinemas. Spectacular, but spectacular without any argument or anything to say. He filmed in the Russian Arctic and in various other areas of spectacular oceanic events. And I'll just show you the trailer and we'll end with that. That's enough material, I think, for us to discuss together. No, that's not. Thank you.